I don't know about you, but I've had a great time during this course. Every time I get a chance to read great stories as old as Gilgamesh, uh, 4,000 years old, wonderful stories from the Bible. I love the Bible. Um, Anything from the Greeks like Homer or Sophocles. I love the stories of Odysseus or Oedipus. I love the various myths that we have just touched at. I love Ovid's Metamorphoses. I love King Arthur. And oh, we've just barely touched on the stories that are available. It's kind of like I'm hoping this semester feels a little bit like going through the potluck line the first time. If you're like me, what I'll often do is I will just put a little bit of some of the things that look good. And then when I find the things I like, I'll go back the second time. And that's what I'll really load up on. That's my uh, that's my way of doing potluck. I give that to you free of charge. Um, I think that one of the things that I would love to leave you with, and I'm calling this my parting thought, has very little to do, if anything at all, to do with the material that we've talked about, other than to say that once upon a time, an educated person was somebody who knew the classics. And by the classics, we generally meant the Greeks, the Romans, and the Hebrews. That was the definition of an educated person, was a person who was familiar with these stories. Today, it's sad to say that in many universities, it's possible to go all the way through without even having encountered many of these. It's even possible to go through without having much encounter with Shakespeare, which I find incredibly tragic, as I find him to be the single greatest genius from a literary perspective that we've ever had. Now, granted, A Midsummer Night's Dream is one play among many, and probably his lightest, well, one of his lightest, nowhere near the depth that you're going to find in a Hamlet or a King Lear or Othello, not even the depth of his history plays, such as my very, very favorite plays, which would be the four plays that would be Richard II, Henry IV parts 1 and 2, and Henry V. Those four actually form a kind of single play, a long single play, that are informative from a historical perspective, absolutely hysterical at times, and as profound as anything you'll find in literature. If I can recommend to those who have the stomach for some heavy thinking and some good belly laughs, it would be those four plays, especially Henry IV, Part 1 and 2. Delightful. But I would actually like to talk about an educated person, because I think many of us take some pride in the fact that we're in college, that we are receiving an education, that when we get to the end of this road, we'll get a little piece of paper that says, I am an educated person. And the question I have is, what has education actually given us? Notice that when Plato, in his parable of the cave, that when he talked about the people who are down there looking at the shadows, who's down there? Well, it's not just your average Joe down there, you and me. He's describing a group of people that are finding patterns in the shadows, who are conferring degrees to each other based on patterns that they think they find. He's describing educated people. That's what he's describing. People who think they know a lot. But it turns out that oftentimes the things that we have spent so much time trying to learn about have been as worthless as trying to find patterns in shadows. It's not that Plato is cynical about education, but I think Plato is very cynical about people who view themselves as educated, because in his mind, the philosopher is always seeking. And but I want to talk a little bit about what has an education really gotten us. And I'm going to call this, so you think you're so smart, A. And this is the commencement address, if you will, that I will not likely ever get to give. And perhaps you'll see why. Now, we're all familiar, of course, with the passage of Scripture that says knowledge will increase. And you must acknowledge that knowledge has certainly increased. I had a friend of mine, his name was Mr. Paul. He was 104 years old. He used to do music therapy, and I would go and I'd visit him weekly. I'd play my guitar and sing. And I remember telling him how fortunate he was in many ways, because he had seen more advancement in technology and in just amazing wonders than anyone else in history. When he was a kid, there were still horse-drawn wagons, and he lived to see not only a couple of world wars, but everything from cars to planes to men on the moon to he had a cell phone. Just phenomenal technological advances. But what have these advances, what has great learning actually gotten us? So the real question is, what have intelligent, well-read college students and professors actually given us? Well, that century of great increase in knowledge and education, it's a wonder, but it's also the bloodiest and most horrific of all of our centuries. Many of you may or may not recognize who this is. If you don't, this is Vladimir Lenin. He is, I would argue, the father of the Soviet Revolution. He is the father of certainly 20th century communism. He took Karl Marx's idea and he put it into application into what would become the Soviet Union. His great revolution was achieved in 1917, and as a result, just him alone, he oversaw probably about 17 million deaths of his own people to achieve his goals. And he said this: students are ideal for revolutions. They know only enough to make them dangerous and more than enough to be easily led. In his mind, students were ideal for his revolution because they were the ones who would easily be led and ultimately led to just not only the deaths of so many, but the enslavement of so many. He also wrote that the university student is ideal enough to believe he knows more than the previous generation. This makes him easily moldable to our cause. There's nothing so easily moldable, there's nothing so gullible as a person who believes they know more than the previous generation. That is common of every generation, I will say, until you get a little older and you begin to realize, maybe my parents and grandparents knew something. This, of course, is somebody that more people will recognize. It's sad to me that people won't recognize everyone on here. We should know them very easily. But this, of course, is Hitler. Hitler resulted in about 60 million deaths. If you're into math, I hope you'll tally these up, because there are going to be a lot of deaths. And he said that the university is where I believe all revolutions such as ours begin. And it's important to remember that 8 of Hitler's 12 advisors were former college professors with PhDs. So I want you to know that college teachers do not get off the hook here. College teachers have been as much a part of the problem. Joseph Stalin, who took over for Vladimir Lenin, and if Lenin killed quite a few, well, Stalin said, "Hold my beer, I'll show you killing." And nobody's sure how many people died under his regime of his own people. The most conservative numbers is about 30 million, and that number may actually be up to as many as 100 million. Probably the most accurate would be about 60 to 80 million of his own people died as a result of his regime. And he said, "Show me an educated man, and I'll show you a mule who has been trained to obey." But he uh, certainly showed that in his life. Of course, here's Chairman Mao of China. He brought that same revolution that Lenin brought to the Soviet Union, made some modifications into a Maoist version of Karl Marx's theories. And during the Cultural Revolution, which is a period of about 3 to 5 years, killed about 35 million of his own people. And you see, this is a dreadful, dreadful period of a time when we think of the 20th century. And he said, with an army of 1 million students, meaning college students, we will easily transform China into utopia. That's what he said before launching into the Cultural Revolution, which resulted in millions of deaths. And he said, students do not know enough yet to be cynical or overly wise. This is why they will follow blindly if we only persuade them that our cause is morally superior. So when we think of the history of communist China, like the history of communist Russia, and in some ways, the Nazi revolution, it was often led by educated people. I would be surprised if many of you know who this is, but your parents and grandparents would. And this is Ho Chi Minh. He was the head of the communist revolution in Vietnam, which was a part of a civil war between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. The United States entered the war to side with South Vietnam, and it fought alongside the South Vietnamese up against the North Vietnamese and Ho Chi Minh. But he resulted in about, well, nobody actually is sure how many millions. After the United States left the country and North Vietnam moved into South Vietnam, he ended up slaughtering about 600,000 women and children in 6 months that he felt might have been tainted by Americans. And he said an American student at one of their, meaning the American universities, is worth 1,000 of my warriors. He felt that those 60s hippies probably were the best allies that he had. As a matter of fact, financially, that was certainly true. And even in his museum, he said the glorious revolution could not have happened without the aid and support of the American university student. This, of course, is from the terrible genocide in Rwanda, Africa, that resulted in several million deaths in this terrible genocide, in this fight. And the Associated Press said the saddest part of the situation is how many involved were college students or college-educated individuals. And that is how many of them were part of doing the slaughtering were college individuals. One of the great tragedies as a Seventh-day Adventist is there was a Seventh-day Adventist college there. And how many Adventist college professors and students actually participated in the genocide? Now, there were many brave ones who didn't, but it chills me a little to think how easily people can get duped into such terrible slaughter. Osama bin Laden, the great architect of 9/11 and other terrorist attacks, he was a very educated person, Harvard educated, and this, according to the Associated Press, as Osama bin Laden himself, educated at Harvard with his family and closest friends, gathered around him a circle of wealthy and well-educated men. Everyone around him actually was educated, most of them at Harvard and other American and Ivy League schools. But you're going to say, well, wait a minute, wait. You're making it sound like college students are responsible, and college teachers, me, I'm going to put myself in that group, are responsible for a lot of brutal things in the 20th century. But haven't college students done a lot? When you think of the civil rights movement in the United States, wasn't that led in large part by college students? Absolutely. College students have done so much good. College professors have done so much good. but college students and professors have also done enormous damage. How do we deal with this? How do we somehow make sense of this disparity? Well, one of my very favorite people in history is Martin Luther King Jr., who was a minister, but also the great leader of civil rights. And he said, education plants the seeds of good intentions. Now, remember, Martin Luther King Jr. was an educated man with a PhD. And so he would understand about education. But he says, but good intentions without a love of freedom are not enough to bring good to the world. Quite the opposite. The century is rife with death thanks to educated people with good intentions. So I guess why I'm saying this is not to make people depressed about their education, but rather to say that you have been given and are in the process of gaining something that makes you both dangerous to the world and potentially absolutely helpful to the world. And that is an education. You are the most dangerous person on the planet, but also potentially the most helpful person on the planet with that education. Martin Luther King also said, education without the moral foundation of religion has done more harm than anything else in the century. I want to argue, if I may, that you are armed and dangerous, but certainly more dangerous than you know. With an education, whether it be ideas that you might get from a literature class, a science class, a philosophy class, any of the medical sciences, business, any of these sorts of things have allowed you to think and think critically, but it also has a potential without the presence of morality, and I would argue without the presence of God. It puts you in a place to begin to believe that education entitles you to a certain amount of opinion over people, that a certain sense of superiority, and ultimately may be something that could prove harmful. But instead, what education should bring is the ultimate wisdom. And the ultimate wisdom, by the way, is humility. That, I believe, is the great wisdom. When we talk about the wisdom of God, when we talk about the wisdom of philosophy, the wisdom of philosophers, it is humility. It's a humility that says that I have something to learn from the person in front of me. I still have things yet to learn about the world, that in my spiritual life, I do not have it all. I grew up a Seventh-day Adventist, and my favorite thing about Adventists is a doctrine that we rarely seem to subscribe to anymore. As a matter of fact, we don't talk about it at all. I'm not sure that as a denomination that we've done a good job at believing in it at all, and that is the doctrine of present truth. And that is that we have a truth that we have at the present, but God is still revealing truths to us, and we must continue to search. Otherwise, we get a kind of arrogance that says we have the truth. And that actually turns into an arrogance that can be unkind, that can be ruthless, that can be cruel. I want to encourage you with the information that you gain in school, and I'm hoping it's something that you've sensed in this class, a passion that I have for great story, a passion I have for great ideas. I love ideas. A passion I have for the past, because I believe that our ancestors have given us great wisdom if we're willing to go through and sift through it, and not to have the arrogance to believe that I am the one who has all. But I have much to learn from those around me and those who've gone before me. That kind of humility is what I consider to be an educated person. Without that, you have an enormous amount of knowledge, but not a lot of wisdom. And my goal has always been in my life to have wisdom. I fail at it badly. I will confess that. I have enjoyed having you so much in my class. And I hope that you'll come up and when you see me sometime on campus, you'll stop and talk to me because I'll confess I haven't had a chance to get to know you personally. So I might not even always realize you were in my class, even though I've seen your pictures and things like that. But it's interesting when you meet people out of the context of a class that it's difficult. Come by and say, hey, I was in your class. Um, but thank you so much. And I just wish all the blessings of God on you. And I hope you will continue to search stories, that you'll continue to love stories, that you'll continue to find God in stories. And that whether that story be pagan myths, even contemporary film, God is reaching out to us. So thank you. And I look forward to getting to see you all. And thank you.